welcome. Thanks for coming to indulge me and hear me talk about a little bit about what we do and some of the research we provide. On this particular topic on learning culture, this is one of those spots in a conference right after lunch, the last day. Believe me, I'm honored that you're all here. But I will do my best to hopefully maybe correct some prejudices with some facts. That's a good way of putting it. I think I already failed the first test, right? So winning with a high impact learning culture. Before I get to that topic, let me get a quick show of hands. How many of you know who Burson & Associates is? Good. That's very helpful. About 3/4 or more of the room. That's great. So, and I suspect if you said yes to that question, that means that you might have seen myself or one of my colleagues or Josh in particular speak. I know Josh was one of the keynotes last year, so that might be to some degree where you've heard of us. We are a research firm, which means just that. It means that we do research. The research that we do is on how organizations do things like employee training and development, the various different talent management practices, performance, succession, leadership development, and the like, as well as HR, how they do those things well, strategically, and per today's topic, drive high impact. That's the lens through which we look at all of the different areas that we research. So what does high impact mean? It means that you can achieve some measurable positive impact on your business's results. Okay? So when we talk about a high impact learning culture, that's really the lens that we're looking through here. Now, as a research firm, we look at a number of different areas. The core of what we do is our membership program. We have a number of companies who are our members. That's the model. They come to us. They license access to our research. They license access to us, right? And I suspect we probably have a few folks in the room who might be members. We certainly have a few here in the UK. So that's really enough about us. This is research-based. So what I'm going to talk about today comes from a number of different research projects we've done over the last few years. Primarily, the bulk of this content comes from a major study we put out last year and have since been working on operationalizing. When I say that, I mean the study was really our first foray. It was a lot of data, and what we've been doing since is building tools, building templates, building repeatable processes, self-scorable assessments, things like that organizations like yourselves would want to use to make this data more actionable and real for your organizations. But without getting too much into the methodology, what we did was we looked at, and this is why I'm going to come back to this notion of high impact. We looked at, lots of people talk about learning culture. In fact, how many of you have read through all the articles in the program guide for this week's event? Wait till I tell Don that. Well, if you do, there are some pretty good pieces in there. And one of them is explicitly about this topic of learning culture. Many of them touch on it fairly significantly. But it reminded me of some of the kind of fundamental decisions we made when we went down this path. That one of the reasons, core to our research in learning is what makes a learning organization high impact, right? What is it about some training functions, some learning and development functions, by whatever words you want to use, whatever you call it, why is it that some of them achieve business impact and some don't? Okay? That's a study that we do with some regularity. Generally about every 3 years or so, we collect that data again to see what's happened, what's changed, how are learning organizations evolving. Well, the last time we did it, which actually we're going to redo it this year, last time was about 3 years ago, we found that the number one predictor of a learning function's ability to impact the business was the culture of learning in the organization. Well, okay, at the time we were like that. We thought to ourselves that's an interesting conclusion. We didn't immediately decide to delve into it any further. In fact, we started looking at some of the more evolutionary changes. So our big research focus immediately following that was what a lot of you, I know, have heard this week, which is what's evolving about how learning does what it does. So, for instance, this notion of informal learning, what does it mean for a learning function to truly begin to incorporate informal learning into its strategies? That's where we went instead. Well, in that research project, we also asked, what is it about the organizations that seem to be, good at what's next? Some learning functions seem to already be on the leading edge of, for instance, being able to successfully operationalize something like informal and social learning. What is it that is different about them? Well, guess what? One of the things was that their organizations have very strong learning cultures. All right, so 2 big studies in a row. We reached that same conclusion. We thought, okay, fine, we get it. We're going to do an in-depth report about this topic. What is this thing? Learning culture is kind of a nebulous term. What does this really mean, right? How would you know if yours is particularly strong? And actually, probably even more importantly, if it's not, what can you do about it? What are other organizations already successfully doing to improve it, right? So we did this massive project. We looked at lots of things that we in the room could possibly think have something to do with learning culture. And in fact, at this point, I'd like to get some sense in the room. When I throw those words out to you, anybody, what pops into your head? Okay, so you don't even know what it is. That's one thing. Well, so what would you think it is? What right now what pops into your head in terms of what do you think learning culture means? So there's 2 things there. So people have a desire, they want to learn, and then they're actually motivated, and they have the ability, they have the freedom to do it. Okay. They have to do it all the way through the company. So from cradle to grave kind of thing. The moment you're inducting and onboarding to retirement, everywhere in between. Okay. Anybody else? Shared beliefs. So in this case, shared beliefs about the value of learning and ongoing development. Absolutely. Someone else. So that's kind of managers see the key value of it. That's an extension, absolutely, an extension of what we've heard so far, but the addition that managers are a very, very important part of this. Anybody else? So learning is actually part of your day-to-day. It's not an intervention. It's not a sabbatical event. It's not something you do away from the job, okay? That time is allowed for it. If it's important, you have to put your money and resources where your mouth is and give it space, okay? Fundamentally, learning is valued, absolutely. Okay, these are all great ideas. And to give you a sense of, without oversimplifying the methodology here, this is essentially what we did when we went into this project went with about 100 possible normative or value-based statements that essentially capture many of the things we've talked about, as well as some things that are more operational, just systemic to how learning tends to happen in organizations. And we compared this big, long list of about 100 possible things to certain key business outcomes and many different organizations. And through qualitative and quantitative research, we found 40 of them, of this 100, that had significant, without, again, digging too much into the details, regressions and the like were involved. 40 of them were predictive, significantly predictive of companies that actually were leading in these different performance indicators. So that gives you a sense of what this is. And we call those 40 now our 40 high-impact learning culture practices, which I'll introduce a bit as we go along. Now, I want to get us started very quickly. And if you've seen one of my presentations, I apologize because you've seen me go through this spiel a bit before. But I want to set kind of a ground for why this is such an important topic. I want to then introduce those 40 practices, what we know about them, and talk through a few examples of how companies have successfully improved them. Now, it's a really challenging world we live in. Not just for, our businesses, but for us as learning professionals. Our workforces are changing. Technologies are making wondrous things possible, but at the same time, they're overwhelming us and our workforces with information. Right? Demographic changes, changes in that the economy is forced in terms of mergers and acquisitions and restructuring and so on and so forth. Suffice to say, it's a pretty chaotic workplace today, regardless of where you are in the world. And one thing we kind of know as learning professionals is always true. When there is big change, especially of the negative economic variety, we happen to be a department that often loses resources early, first. But we're also a department that is always asked to help pick up the pieces, right? So we have to rethink what we do. When we look at the world, we look at our workforces, and we see all these changes, the one thing that is true is that our traditional notions of learning and development cannot stay the same. Otherwise, we risk not going away. In fact, we're going to be here. What we risk is irrelevancy. What we risk is that one day we wake up and our learning organization still exists, but who does it report to now? The chief legal officer. Why? Because our really only function is compliance. And the businesses will have long since moved on because we're no longer relevant to them getting better. Right? That's the risk. Right? Now, we do a number of kind of demographic pieces of research. One of the things we do, one of them is called Talent Watch. We do it twice a year, and it's meant to be a trending study. We ask leaders in HR and leaders in business, essentially what's really important to you right now, what's keeping you up at night, and we keep asking these questions time and time again to see what's changing over time. What you see here is a comparison of a couple of recent versions of this. And you would not be surprised if I had told you that, in May 2009, financial pressure to cut costs was very high on everyone's mind. Not a surprise. But what is interesting about this is that as we did it again late last year, what's growing? Innovation, global expansion, business growth. Well, I, for one, read that and that's really optimistic. That means that the business leaders, the HR leaders, are thinking forward. They're thinking about what life is like now on the other side of the recession, right? But it also means they're looking for a different set of things from us, right? 35% of organizations see the need to accelerate innovation as their biggest need. That's the highest it's been in 4 years. 51% struggling to find the right talent. Who in here do these two things not really resonate with? Right. Now, I mentioned what's different. What's different here is the people that we serve. Right? We're learning professionals. We're about, and this whole topic, learning culture, it's ultimately about how well does the organization learn, how well do the employees that we serve learn, and the thing is that they're different too. Right? They're connected. They have different expectations these days about what organizations should do for them. We all know that, even something like technology, why is it that it's so much easier to find, in many organizations, and I'd be interested to see if this, you raise your hand if this resonates with you, it's easier to find long-lost friend in high school than it is to find the document you need at work. How long can that last? Right? Now, okay, so that's a little frame setting. Let's dig into the information. So what we find when we look at high-impact learning organizations is that they positively affect their business essentially in three ways. The first is the one that you're most familiar with, and that's skill and competency development. That is fundamental. It's what we've been doing as learning and training all along. We've also added to that, in many organizations, this strategic layer, which is our connection to integrated talent management and capability development. So how do we help the organization meet its long-term needs? Third is this question of learning culture. It rises to the level of these first two, and it should be thought of, kind of prefacing a bit of the message today, it should be thought of as just as important in many ways, if not more so than the other two. Now, this piece of information actually comes from, I mentioned how we first got onto this topic 3 years ago when we did our last high-low study, learning organization study. Remember I said that culture turned out to be the #1 predictor. This is from that data set 3 years ago. When organizations that said essentially that that identified themselves through different sorts of questions as having a strong learning culture, 3 times more they were, well, I should say they were around. The high-performing organizations were 3 times more likely to have that strong learning culture. So we knew it mattered. So what was it? What is it? What makes it up? Well, I mentioned that we started off through the lens of business. Who in here's company does not want to be more productive or have more productive employees? Right. Who doesn't want to be more innovative? Who doesn't want to have more satisfied customers, greater market share, get to market faster, right? These are the things that your business ultimately cares about, right? So this is where we started from. We didn't want to look at what would be an ideal learning culture. We could all agree in here what sort of a utopian workplace looked like that we'd all would like to work at. That's not why we're in business. We wanted to look at, from this point of view, what of those various different normative statements that we were all making earlier, what of those various different values that your company could espouse and demonstrate, right, actually drive these things? Well, quick definition. It's kind of nebulous, I agree, but it kind of gives us a start, something to work with. Fundamentally, our definition for learning culture, everything about your company that encourages and enables what we talked about earlier, already in the room. The individual and the collective organization to constantly improve. Okay. Pretty wide definition, I know, but it's something to get started. This is the summation of what our research tells us. This is our model. It's a bit busy, so let me walk you through it. I mentioned those 40 practices that we identified as predictive. 40 is a big number. It's kind of hard to get your head around. What we found in the study, and I don't think this is going to, cultures are different. I suspect it's not going to sound like it's rocket science if I said to you that different companies have different learning cultures. And that's okay, right? Different companies have different needs, different states of maturity. Startups versus, I was just talking to someone, I'm not sure if she's in the room or not, just talking to someone who's working for a company that's 250 years old. Okay. Very different than the IT startup, right? So it's not surprising that learning cultures are going to be different in those cases. And your company may be of the type for which innovation is really what's most important to you. Or your company may be of the type where you're in a different space, different industry, what have you. And so in your case, customer satisfaction may be of more interest. Or in your case, time to market may be more interest. What we found was that different subsets of those 40 practices would be important for different organizations, depending on which of these different outcomes was most important to your company. And this has real implications then when we start talking about how to change your learning culture, how to improve your learning culture. You're not going to just do what everybody else does. Culture changes very slowly. I talk about it as a mountain. It's like moving a mountain, right? You move mountains one bucket of dirt at a time. Right? Well, with that in mind, you have to be very clear about where you're going and what you're trying to do, because it's going to be incremental. You're going to measure that change that way. So with that in mind, you're going to decide that, we're more of a we're not creating products constantly. So innovation, it's important, but really we really more care about cost and customer satisfaction. Okay, then you're going to focus on a different set of these of that 40. Now, to help make that a little more workable and understandable, the 40 practices break up into 6 very easy to think about categories, and those are those boxes along the top. Building trust. Why would building trust be important to a learning culture? Anybody? We'll start over here. What? You believe what you're hearing, that's good, yeah? And there was someone over here. To learn successfully, you need to feel, absolutely. You know what, learning is really a risky thing. Maybe not so much for your new hires, for your first-time employees. They're new. Nobody cares necessarily if they fall on their face a couple times. It's expected. How hard is it? Who in here has responsibility for executive development in any form or fashion? Okay. How hard is it to get your executives into a classroom because they need to learn something? Why is that? Because learning is risky. The company there has to be a level of trust for learning to happen. We have to trust that the organization and our needs are at least somewhat in sync. Okay? 2, encouraging reflection. My guess is that some of you in the room, how many of you have heard of things like reflective learning cycles and double loop learning and so on and so forth, right? We know the value of learning from questioning our assumptions and from learning from our mistakes and our successes, right? How many of you here in the room, your companies have project postmortems or after-action reviews? A few, okay. Of those of you who raise your hands, how many of those after-action reviews or project postmortems would most people who take part in them say, they're just a checkbox activity we're told to do, nothing really comes out of them that's substantive? About half of those folks. I can tell you right now, as learning professionals, you want to affect positive change on your learning culture, go to your business and say, let us help you make that project postmortem better. You will do few learning interventions that are more effective in the long run than anything else you do. Why? Because you're encouraging learning from the business, right? So that's reflection. 3, we talked about at the beginning, learning's value. The company has to demonstrate that learning is valuable, and they have to give it time and resources commensurate with that overall understanding. 4, knowledge sharing. I know several of the sessions this week have been about the kind of burgeoning interest in, for instance, collaboration and social learning. Knowledge has to flow, and the organization has to encourage it to flow. 4, empowerment. One of the very first folks this afternoon said people have to have the space, right? And part of that's also the power and the authority. They have to feel like they can step outside the box every once in a while, right? They have to feel like they can try something new. And finally, someone also mentioned that learning has to be an everyday thing. We have to formalize learning as a process, and those different ways that the organization works to make learning happen every day, not just the twice a year where you're checking off those compliance requirements, right? Oh, well, before I go forward. And so we all know that learning, and there's lots of different models for learning. I'm not going to get into that. We just put up here 3 very simplistic, I should explain the other boxes on the chart, 3 very simplistic things that we know are, regardless of how you think about learning, we know there's an ability element. Do you have the ability to learn? There's a motivation element. Do you want to learn? And then there's the acquisition and application of knowledge and skills itself, right? These things are constantly happening, and they're constantly in a spinning motion, and it's sitting in the environment, systems thinking here, that is your company. And that system that is your company is really the effect of those 6 boxes. But you cannot think about that system, someone also mentioned this afternoon, without thinking about these 2 groups. Because no other part of the system has more effect on it overall than your leadership and management. I'll explain why. Okay, I can't show you all 40 of them today. I'm happy to give you a copy of the 40, but that's something, if you don't mind, my colleague Alan is sitting in the front row. Just make sure he gets a card or something. We'll send you the 40. This is the top 10. I'm not going to go through them all. I don't have time to go through them today, but this is the top 10. We stack rank them in terms of their overall effect on the aggregate of those business outcomes. Understand, when you look at 10 outcomes in aggregate, it gets a little fuzzy. But still, I think it's still useful to understand that when we looked at that number 1, your leaders are open to bad news. Why would that be important to having a strong learning culture? Not that they're okay with it. Doesn't say anything about complacency, but they can hear it. Why would that be the most important, impactful on all 10 of those outcomes significantly? Practice. Learning by failing. Yeah, well, your leadership has to understand that value first and foremost. Right? That was the number one. But you see the others here, and you see the category we put them in, the relative impact on those overall outcomes. We have that for all 40. Leaders are open to bad news, asking questions, decision-making processes are clearly defined. You have to know what the rules are to know how to step outside the bounds. Employees are frequently given tasks or projects that stretch. So a stretch goal, job rotational assignment, stuff like that, right? You know what? Of all the 40, the one that actually most looks like something that training departments sometimes do is that one, which doesn't even happen in training. Now, one of the top 10, just so learning professionals, you don't feel too bad about this, is that number 9 here, the employees generally believe that the opportunities given to them by you all are of high value. That's key. But that's 9th on this list. Most of them, as you'll see, really have more to do with what the business does. Now, when we looked at them, and we looked at who owned each of the 40, who would own primarily responsibility for how that happens and changing it, even more importantly, in your organization, we found the preponderance of them, by far, are actually owned by your line managers. The next biggest group, owned by your senior leadership. Not even a 5th owned by us in the learning organization. Now, we know that. One of the things we also found, though, in terms of there is a qualitative part to our research. We talked to a lot of companies. The best of learning organizations, the one that had the strongest culture by our study, they actually explicitly knew this, but they owned that it was still their responsibility to move this mountain. But they understood that they weren't going to do it without pushing and prodding, and occasionally even being a little bit, I'm here forgive me, I'm here in Britain, to be a bit cheeky about it, being a provocateur, occasionally poking their leadership, maybe sometimes above the board, maybe sometimes below the board, but because it's the leadership that's actually going to make this change happen. You guys are the ones that are going to convince them of the need or occasionally even trick them into doing it. But it's going to be a sort of secondary role. Now, it's worth doing. When we looked at, once we identified those 40 that were so predictive, we looked at the organizations who seem to be the strongest performers at those outcomes. So the organizations that had the fastest go-to-market times, the best customer satisfaction, all those kinds of things, right? What you're seeing here in terms of the orange, this is the overall, and again, it's an aggregate of the 10, so bear with me, it's a little fuzzy. The aggregate of the 10 outcomes is this orange thing in the middle. It's bell curve. Not surprising. Some organizations are good, some are great, some are bad, most are in the middle. You expect that. To make this easier to look at, we went ahead and colored in the high performers in red. That's your top 10% of companies. Okay? That blue line is the distribution of people at those 40 culture practices. There is a remarkable fidelity between strong cultures, high performers. And when we look, this is just the overall one. When we look at this in deeper splits, which we do this in the report, this is innovation. Just the outcome that is innovation. This is the bell curve of companies overall at innovation. That's your top performers. That's your strong cultures. There's some of these that makes some sense. Our one that we call learning agility, that's a measure of, do you think your company learns faster than your market? It's exactly the same. They're literally exactly the same. But most of them are like this. They're pretty close. Learning culture is a business strategy. You want to get better at innovation. If any of you are CLOs in the room, your execs come to you and say, we got to be better at innovation. You're not going to address innovation with a program. You're not. You're going to address innovation by addressing systemically the culture of learning in your organization. How do you know? You can have, you guys probably have, most of the folks in this room, really great corporate universities, great programs, great You do the mechanics of traditional L&D really, really well. But how do you know that you are valuing learning at this level, that you are empowering your employees, that you're encouraging people to take risks and the like, right? Well, one, your role, I apologize, this is kind of hard to read, I'm sure from the back there. Your relationship with your companies is changing. And I'm not going to go too much into this one in detail because I know it's been covered quite a bit by other speakers, including, to some degree, I think, part of what Roger was talking about on first day is that you are not going to be the source of blessed knowledge anymore. Or maybe that's going to be a very small part of your role. Your primary role is, I like to use a financial market term, is you're going to be a market maker for knowledge. What's a market maker do? It's what makes stock markets work. They connect buyers to sellers. Without them, there'd be no way to get necessarily efficiently stocks from buyers to sellers. You do that role for learning and knowledge in your organization. You connect people who need it with wherever it is. But the thing is that wherever it is different than it used to be. It's not just it's in a course or a classroom or an e-learning, what have you. It's now it's in an expert's head. It's in an external community of practice or an internal community of practice. It's wherever it needs to be. You're connecting people to people and people to knowledge. This is our learning framework. It's our way of thinking about what's kind of in scope for enterprise learning functions today. You have programs you do. Those programs are really they're really a set of audiences and problems and environments. So sales. It's not really about sales training programs. It's about sales and getting people to be better salespeople. And so you give them a portfolio of offerings. And increasingly that portfolio is not intervention-driven. It's environment-driven. But so you have a bunch of approaches that you use. This is your kit of things that are available to you, formal and informal. You have disciplines you have to master to do what you do. That, in the past, was instructional design, project management. Now it's things like community management. You have tools and technologies you use, and you cannot ignore this. It has to become a fundamental part of your overall learning strategy. You have to know every time you do something, what is the impact of the culture of learning in my organization on the success of my whatever it is I'm about to do, and vice versa. How is what I'm about to do, initiative-wise or otherwise, helping to improve the culture? Let me start to close down, because I want to make sure I give you plenty of time for questions. When we looked at organizations that by our data set do this well, very strong in those practices, we came away with 7 overall strategy is probably it's the best word we could come up with. It's maybe not necessarily as defined as a true strategy should be, but 7 overall themes or paths, common paths that these organizations seem to be taking. Okay, 1, this notion of integrated talent management and thinking of learning as capability development. In fact, I know several learning organizations, that's the name they've changed themselves to, because it helps to raise. There's something about vocabulary. Choice of language is key, is a really important part to this, but it's even more than that. If you think of yourself as tactical, guess what? The company will too. You have to think of yourself as strategic. You help drive the long-term development of your organization's capabilities. You are as much part of the supply chain as the folks who are making widgets and digging up resources from the ground. Right? 2, your culture of leadership, obviously, with the fact that your leadership is going to drive most of this, is key. And when I say that, I mean the organizations that seem really good at this, they get that cradle-to-grave mentality. They know that from day one, they're talking to people about what it means to be leaders in the company, and leaders, what part of that definition fundamentally is development, is instilling in the first-time management training programs that you have that the most important role of a supervisor is as a coach, right? And trying to build that value in from the first time you get somebody, they've never been a people manager before in their life, that's when you want to start to build that kind of concept, right? 3, making use of your onboarding programs, your induction programs. Again, some of the best organizations we talk to, It's in their recruiting pamphlets and such that learning is important to us and development is important to us, and we will be providing you resources from the moment you walk through the door. We don't just, individual development plans is not just an acronym to us. We give you time and attention to make it happen, and they use that as part of their recruiting strategy, and then they back it up. 4, never waste those times when no one has a choice and they have to come to your classroom. Compliance training gets a bad rap, but think about it. Think like a marketer. Compliance training is one of those few times when you have everybody in the company's eyeballs. You cannot waste that opportunity. You have to think like you have a brand. And if you let somebody leave one of your opportunities with a bad taste in their mouth, essentially shame on you, because you are harming the brand that is learning in your organization. Now, obviously, compliance is usually not on balance, one of the most strategic things you do. So I'm not saying you need to necessarily devote huge segments of your budget to it. But find ways to take what is obviously, a less interesting and important set of activities and to drive additional value from that process. So people do leave thinking, oh, I got something out of it, not just the company. 5, embedded learning. That's our when we look at informal learning, we break it into 3 boxes. You probably saw that on that framework. On demand, which is just how we, it's the way that we put out knowledge resources and let people get them on their own. Social, which makes sense. It's how we learn from each other. Embedded gets to how we learn in the function of work itself. So I talked about after-action reviews. I talked about project postmortems. You saw on that list of the top 10 the importance of job rotations, of stretch goals, of apprenticeship programs, mentoring, what have you, right? Make use of embedded learning. Get people to recognize the value that the learning that they get from work. Right? Institutionalized knowledge sharing. You've gotten lots of great ideas this week for what that looks like. And then your performance management processes. One of those categories was formalizing learning as a process. Well, how many of you in here have performance appraisal processes? Just about everybody. Okay. How many of you would say that those appraisal processes, on balance, are more about development than they are about compliance and compensation? Maybe 2 or 3. That's a problem. Not that those things aren't important, but we've gone way, way, way too, as far as pendulum swings are concerned, way, way, way too in the direction of manage up and manage out. Think about the process that is an appraisal. It's one of the few times where it could be of so much value to the organization and to the individual. If you just thought of it as, at least give equal weight to that process as a way to drive coaching and development. Now, I want to share with you a few examples quickly and some other data in each of these different strategies. In the capability development area, there are a lot of good organizations out there that get this, and they're thinking about, for instance, specialization and skill specialization. And so these are ways for the company to understand the strategic value of learning. The company begins to understand how skills essentially map to the long-term performance of the company. And so it's not just about growing leaders as in up a hierarchy. It's about specialist leaders. It's about what makes your company truly different. And are we developing leadership in those things, not just the general, future CEOs? In fact, other folks are collecting similar data in similar ways. Credit Suisse, it doesn't necessarily always have. You can use sort of intervening variables, I think, to make this point. They've done work inside their organization that shows a very clear connection between things like your learning and development programs and your career opportunities and what have you, and something like engagement. Okay. I suspect most of you measure engagement. You do engagement surveys and the like, right? That's easy. So you can establish the relationship between what you do and whether an employee is engaged. Because you probably actually maybe even ask a question about development. And so you can kind of figure that one out probably. Well, guess what? They then did the other end of this. they mathematically proved a very strong correlation between engagement, satisfaction, and then ultimately between CSAT and profit. Again, proving the value to the business of learning. Who here is familiar with TELUS? Few. Okay, TELUS is Canada's largest wireless provider. They hired a new CLO a few years ago, and they gave him the task of, we want you to turn the learning organization over. We want to, everything I've said so far, we're going to be more innovative, more collaborative, what have you. Where did he start? He started with leadership. He got the C-suite to agree that we need to redefine what it means to be a leader at TELUS. And it's about engagement. It's about collaboration. It's about, and so forth, right? So everything that they did on leadership development from there on out hits on these themes. Everything. It's constant. It's a constant refrain in the organization, and it's beginning to show up elsewhere. Quick, quick examples from some of their websites. I just wanted to show you this because this, for instance, this is what you're brand new to TELUS. It's the first thing you see is, you're going through the induction process. Your culture, your career, your incentives, they're talking about these things, and they're demonstrating a value for them. Cisco. You all know Cisco. Is anybody from Cisco here? No? Okay. This is a program we have a case study on. It's called their Executive Action Learning Forum. It's a high-potential leadership development program. They do it about once a year, about 40 students at a time. This is developing those people who they think are going to be their execs of the future. The program itself involves some formal classroom events, about 6 weeks long, but it's mostly collaborative, distance, community kinds of things. But it's an action learning program at its core. So everybody in here know what that is, or should I explain action learning? Anybody need me to define that for you? No? Okay, good. So it's an action learning program. You're giving these folks who go through this program a problem, a real business problem, a vetted business problem, and these teams are asked to help try and figure the problem out. And they don't pick things that are just, really, not really of interest. They pick things that have strategic value, that there is risk if they get it wrong. Because that's key. People have to feel like there's some risk here, right? And they give them these projects, and they work on these projects as part of a leadership development program, the idea being that they want to generate a real product, a real solution to whatever the problem is, right? Well, this is a big deal for Cisco. It is the core to how they do their leadership development, and it's actually a source of innovation for the company. A couple years ago, one of the projects that came out of one of these programs is responsible for everything Cisco's doing today in terms of intelligent electricity grids. They estimate that project alone is generating somewhere in the neighborhood about $5 billion in revenue over the next couple years. That's a training program. $5 billion in revenue. This is helping to prove, not that Cisco's pretty good at this anyway, but it's helping to prove the value of learning to the bottom line. Right? Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S., who's familiar with what they are? There's the U.S.'s central banking system, right? Not kind of quasi-governmental, not an organization you necessarily would think would be kind of cutting edge with this sort of thing, right? They are as forward-thinking when it comes to institutionalized knowledge sharing and collaboration as any organization I know. They've been doing it for 10 years consistently, but they started very small and very slowly, and it was nothing more than, let's get experts in a room, call it a knowledge sharing day, we'll bring people in, these are veterans, they don't like to do any other kind of collaboration, so we have to kind of trick them in a way. They do like to talk shop. They love to talk, share war stories. So these are the bank examiners, the people whose job it is to go out and audit banks and make sure they're in compliance with laws. They bring them into a room and they say, here's a scenario. What would you guys do about it? Have some food. We'll be back later. And they talk. Oh, by the way, there's a camera in the corner of the room. They're recording these things. When the conversation's done, they break them up into 2-minute video snippets. They make those video snippets searchable. They introduce them slowly because they introduce them into their new hire schools. It takes like a 7-year process to become a fully vetted auditor. So there's a lot of training involved. But they introduce the system as a performance support tool in training first. And then, once they got people used to it, they actually introduced it as a performance support system to the field. It took off. People really liked this. It was a quick way to get how to solve a very specific problem. Well, a weird thing happened along the way. I'm not sure if they actually showed up here or not, but in the States, Intel had a whole advertising program about the quality of their employees, basically how they had rock stars. Did that make it over here? Okay. There is this really great commercial where there's this Indian gentleman walking into the break room, and people are just like fawning over him, right? And because he's the inventor of USB. Intel's making the point, look, this is the kind of rock star we have, right? Well, at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, a weird thing was happening. Some of the most senior, I will say, they actually said this, crotchety old bank examiners were suddenly becoming rock stars because they were showing up in this search engine as being the ways to solve this certain problem, talk to this certain individual, or when you're dealing with a CEO and they're really angry because you're telling them that their bank is not following the laws, here's the right word to shut them up, right? They're creating value for collaboration. Today, they have to turn people away. It doesn't matter how old you are in that company. Some of their most senior folks are volunteering left and right to do every kind of collaborative and social learning, including discussion groups and things like internal uses of Twitter and the like, because they've built that value slowly. But they still did it. Development planning, I won't go into this too much. I just want to point it out. This is kind of some of the stuff we do in the other research. Organizations that bother, this is about building learning as a process again. Organizations that bother to have some kind of systemic approach to development planning, they have almost twice the median revenue per employee. That's ammunition that you can go to your business leaders with and say, why do we want to make you guys do development plans? Right? Okay, yeah, absolutely. So let me wrap up with just saying culture is a business strategy. These are just sort of summary things. Some of the organizations have strong business cultures, better innovation, better time to market, better quality, et cetera, right? Bottom line, these business results are dependent on the culture of learning in your organization. Notice that most of what I talked about today had very little to do with what most of you probably spend most of your time on. That's a problem that we in the learning profession have to figure out how to solve. And a lot of it's going to be how you change your relationship with the business and how you begin to figure out how to be more systemic in what you do, how to be more environmental in what you do. And also part of it's just how you engage the leadership and how they engage you, right? But we have to embrace a lot of new skill sets, a lot of new disciplines, a lot of new ways of thinking about learning in organizations. For instance, like Roger's presentation at the beginning of the week. But ultimately, those business leaders and managers are critical to our success. Okay, that's it for today. You want to follow us? If you're not already members, we'd love to have you. But if that's not something that's in the cards in the short term, we have our website, we have our blogs, our Twitter feeds. Feel free to follow me. I can't say that I tweet a lot, but it happens. And thank you, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you.